Hello, all, and welcome back to another episode of Movies and Us, a weekly gathering place filled with conversations about movies, stories, and connection. My name is Jennifer Hahn.
And I'm Sarah Callan.
And today we're going to be reviewing the film First Reformed, and we are joined by a very special guest. He's been on the pod a couple of weeks ago for our Princess Bride episode, and we are back with a very different type of conversation. But Andrew is back, y'all. Andrew, do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I am so humbled to be back once again. Thank you, Jen and Sarah, for allowing me to come back. This was the easiest podcast second guest appearance I've ever had to do in terms of like signing on. We had so much fun for Princess Bride, and I thought this is an easy yes. And so, yeah, thank you for having me back. I'm Andrew from the Revisionist Almanac.
Awesome. Yeah, we are pumped to dive into this. It's so funny because I feel like we had just like rainbows and sparkles and butterflies in our Princess Bride episode. It was all good vibes, good feels. You know, we're like, oh, we love this movie. It means so much to us. And we're really about to dive in fully to the deep end with First Reformed, which I think would be really fun to see all of our thoughts about this movie. Before we dive into the movie itself, this movie is actually part of a little mini series we're doing here on the pod in the month of October, where we were excited to just watch films that meant a lot and were really impactful for some of the friends of the pod. So we collected a bunch of recs, and this was one of them. So this was actually a film that Andrew recommended to us for us to get to watch and talk about together. So before we dive in, Andrew, I'm just curious, like, when did you watch this film for the first time? What was that like? And maybe a little bit about why this was on your list, your little bundle of films that you suggested.
Sure. So, well, to begin with, I think if I remember right, when you asked me to put together a list, I don't know if I knew that it was a list for an episode I was maybe going to feature on. So I feel like I put together a very, and I believe, Sarah, you used the word maybe eclectic or something about my list, which is like code for that's a strange list, because it was.
Yes, but it's great. Like, strange is not bad. It is a good eclectic list.
I had to go back and look through the list, and I'm like, wow, I picked some very interesting choices. This was probably, in a weird way, the safest choice, which is interesting based on what the other things I picked. But yeah, so I was very happy that you chose me for this one. I saw this movie back in 2017. I remember seeing it for the first time. I remember being a big fan of it initially. I was very much in the camp that I thought Ethan Hawke deserved an Oscar nomination back in the day. Was surprised he got snubbed, which is kind of, when I talk about like the genesis of my own show, which is sort of a revised Oscars podcast, I always point to the Ethan Hawke snub in 2017 and say, like, this is one of those things that I want to go back and fix potentially. So yeah, I've always been a big fan of the movie, and I go back probably once a year to watch it because I'm so enraptured with just the thematic weight of the movie. And I think you all tricked me by having me come on for Princess Bride and doing like the easiest movie possible, and then you throw the curveball at me with this one. So it's been fun to kind of cover two ends of the spectrum in two episodes, but that's what I'm here for.
Yeah, Sarah and I were joking. We're like, we're about to like really learn so much about each other, y'all, and our thoughts and our opinions and our feelings after this one. You know, like, it was fun and games on Princess Bride, but we diving in fully with First Reformed. So this will be really, I think this is a movie that begs to be talked about, is kind of the feeling that I have after watching it. So I'm like so glad that I get to pick both of your brains and for us to share our thoughts about this movie. Okay, Sarah, kick us off with an IMDb summary for First Reformed.
A minister of a small congregation in upstate New York grapples with mounting despair brought on by tragedy, worldly concerns, and a tormented past.
All right. That is a smoothie of three big things. Like mounting despair, a tormented past. I forget what the third one was. I'm already overwhelmed by the first two.
If you're listening, buckle up. This is going to be a really intense hour.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Okay. I'm always excited for one-sentence summaries, but I'm especially excited for one-sentence summaries for this movie. So this is a little Movies in Us tradition. We go around and share what our one-sentence summary for the film is. So Andrew, as our guest, what is your one-sentence summary for First Reformed?
This was one of the harder things I've ever had to do in the podcasting realm. and I've done quite a lot of guest appearances this year. So, but I think it was a good challenge to have, and I thought I've been contemplating this for a full week, and up until last night, I didn't have an answer for you because there were too many thoughts flooding through my head. But today, I actually came up with two options. I have a serious option and a more whimsical option, and I thought the movie is so serious, and we're going to be having some serious conversations. So I don't really want to go that route. So I'm going to go the more whimsical route. And so my one sentence summary would be: First Reformed, a friendly reminder to call a doctor and schedule your annual physical exam.
Yes. Yep.
Oh.
Because at least from a male perspective, I often forget to go to the doctor on a regular basis. And without spoiling anything in this movie, you might want to get a checkup every now and then.
Well, it's so funny because before we hit record, or in our early conversation, you were talking about how you watch this once a year. So this is now making so much sense. This is your annual reminder to go to the doctor, as well as contemplate the existential nature of our existence. Just a little pairing for us. Yeah.
Goes hand in hand.
Sarah, what is your one sentence summary for First Reformed?
Mine is: a handwritten journal hates to see Paul Schrader coming.
Well done.
Oh my gosh.
All of them.
It's in all of his movies.
Yes. When that first voiceover starts, I'm like, let me buckle in my seatbelt, get comfy. I'm about to really contemplate my existence.
It's become such a trope that it's like almost laughable at this point now. Like, yeah, it's all of them.
He has to do it. Yeah. All right. My one sentence summary is: when self-care journaling doesn't work, throwing on a fluffy white robe and daydreaming about your crush might also not be the answer.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, it's so good.
So I take it that all three of us have really reacted to this movie with whimsy out of survival. Sheer survival. Okay, well, let's dive in and talk a little bit at a high level, our review and thoughts about this film. And I think it's helpful, especially since our relationship to these movies and mileage has differed over time. I'd be intrigued to hear, is this the first time you're seeing this? And if it's not, what are things, especially in multiple rewatches, especially for you, Andrew, as you've seen this now once a year, like what are these new things maybe this time around that really stood out to you or deepened or that you hadn't noticed from the first watch? That's always fascinating to me, is those multiple rewatches and what starts to crop up a little bit more. So, Andrew, do you want to share a little bit about kind of your relationship with this film? It sounds like multiple years. And then this time specifically, what stood out to you extra much?
Yeah, so I think initially when I saw it in 2017, most of my focus and attention was on Ethan Hawke specifically, and just being captivated by his acting performance, which tends to be the way I watch a lot of films the first time. Is I'm sort of drawn to the actors first and foremost, which is pretty obvious. But as I unpack things over and over, and I watched this movie 3 times in the last week for prep, which might have been a little overdoing it, but I like to, torture myself sometimes. The more I watch the movie, it's all the technical stuff that comes out, and we'll get into a lot of it, but I think the thing that comes out of this movie more and more and more each time is the aspect ratio being so different than almost every other film. It's in a 4:3 aspect ratio, and the idea of claustrophobia. The movie really feels like it's closing in on you the more you watch it. It's so insular, and it's so lonely at times and isolated. And I think the more I watch it, the more I start to understand Schrader's prowess on the technical side of things, where initially when I watched it, I was really drawn to the acting. It's all the stuff behind the scenes and how quiet the movie is early on. And then as the film goes a little later, the score starts to come in, really kind of throws you off with kind of the dissonance of it. And so, yeah, it's really all the technical stuff that's come out over the last few years, which is why I do kind of gravitate back to it, because there's all these little nuggets of things in the movie that are not surface level, that are what I think it's what true art does, is it sticks with you long after the credits roll. And this is a piece of art more than just a film, in my opinion.
That's so good. Yeah. Yeah, that lasting power where it's just you find yourself continuing to like boomerang back to it, and uh, finding yourself thinking about that one scene or that one line that someone said that somehow like needs to be ruminated on and savored even longer than the film has ended. I love that. I love that. Sarah, what are your thoughts about First Reformed? Second time, or perhaps more, watching this
Yes.
film.
Yeah. Yeah, I first watched this in, I think, 2020. And I think it was on my top 10 list of that year.
Mm-hmm.
I really enjoy this movie. I am drawn to very melancholy things, and this to me fits in that bucket. There's a lot about despair in this, and for some reason, I enjoy watching movies about despair. So here we are. I don't know what that says about
She
me,
says with a
but
smile.
whatever, it works. But I'm really fascinated with, a lot of the themes that this film grapples with, and I think that so many of them are so like relevant to our lives and our existence. And I like that this movie can make you think about so many topics that might seem separate, but there are intersections and connections between them. And I think that that's a really like valuable reminder. And then of course there's all of those technical things that you said, Andrew. I love a good 4:3 aspect ratio. Like, oh my gosh, the second that I saw that, I was like, yes, I'm here, I love this. And just a lot of the really it's a lot of just like still camera shots. You don't have a lot of camera movement, and so it's just slow in some regards until it kind of gets unhinged, and it's just this like contemplative movie, but it's also about despair at the same time. And so I think there's just a lot here to consider and think about. And I think that so many things just work together so beautifully in this film. So I am a big fan. I think the one thing that I don't love is the ending. I have some feelings about the ending. But other than that, love this movie.
I am now intrigued. Your feelings about the ending. Okay. Uh, that'll be fascinating. We'll get there. We'll get there. So this is my first time watching this film. I have heard Sarah talk about this film, and she'll be very vague, but I can tell there's a lot of feelings, and so I'm like always intrigued. And so when it was also recommended by you, Andrew, I was like, we gotta do this. I must satisfy this curiosity finally. Because she'll say things like, yeah, there's a lot to talk about with this one. I'm like, oh, that one, yeah. And you're like, what does this mean? What does this mean? And I get it now. I get it. I felt, and this doesn't happen often with movies, but I felt the limitations of the amount of brain cells I had happening while I was watching this movie as it was unfolding in front of me. Like there are scenes that I literally paused and like went back to rewatch again because I was like, I need to re-soak in that all over again. The one that stands out to me a lot is that first conversation he has with Michael. There's so much. It's like you mentioned, Andrew, beyond just a movie. It's like this philosophical musing about wisdom and discernment and despair and hope, and that alone is beautiful and incredible. And there's so much meat, let alone in the context of everything else that's happening in this film. The amount of themes that this film is able to cover, the concept of like obviously isolation and extremism, but the intersections of that with things like religious groups and organizations and the growth of those, and how does that intertwine with these environmental issues and the youth. There's so much in this like kaleidoscope here, and we will only probably be able to talk about like a couple of beads, and I feel the layers there that have yet to be discovered by me, but upon more rewatches, I'm sure this movie will deepen. So there's just so much to mull on. I found myself constantly thinking about Taxi Driver while watching this movie. Obviously, it makes a lot of sense. The common denominator is just like a both very Paul Schrader type of films and themes. And it was fascinating to see how obviously many similarities there are, but also how different the characters and the journeys and their motivations are as well. What Travis is motivated by and some of the ways that his mental states descend looks quite different in a lot of ways that it does for Toller. So that was fun to just, maybe it was like my anchor point in this like very, very big experience. It's just like, I need something to like make sense of this, and like also a frame of reference to be able to compare again. So that was really fun to think about these movies in conversation together. So there's a lot to talk about with this one. Okay, well, let's include a spoiler alert. If you haven't seen First Reformed, it came out, I think, 4 years ago. So we recommend checking it out. Based on our 3 high-level reviews here, it should be plenty for you to feel excited and motivated and curious about this film. So we're not going to spoil this movie, and we're going to dive right in. All right. So where do we want to start? I'm actually, if we can, because I think that the ending is so fascinating to think about in terms of the thesis of the film. And, there's all this discourse online around like what actually happened and the multiple interpretations. So I'm intrigued, 1, to hear, Sarah, what your feelings are about the ending, but then 2, Andrew, how do you interpret this ending? And has it changed over time, actually, as you've gotten more times and reps with this film, where you're like, actually, my interpretation is like vastly different from what it was in the first watch?
Yeah, so I would say the first time I watched it, I took it much more literally. Just on, I don't know, I'm the type of person that gets so wrapped up in a movie that it drives my wife nuts, that she can like, we'll turn on a movie and 5 minutes in, she's like, this is going to be what happens at the end or whatever. She can always pull those things out. She's very analytical like that. And immediately I'm like in the movie and I'm not even thinking about the next scene or the next moment. And so in this movie, when I saw it the first time, I was very much like, oh yeah, this is what's happening. It's very literal. And only after I got home and kind of unpacked it and tried to figure things out did my interpretation of the end change. And over time, I think I've sort of solidified my opinion on the end, which is that it is Toller having already killed himself in some fashion, and it's sort of his dreamlike state before he goes to the afterlife or the next place, or whatever the case may be, his final moment before he dies. But I think there's a scene a little bit earlier on when he and Mary are laying one on top of the other. Mary's right on top of him, and they have that whole experience and sort of that hallucination, and they actually start levitating in the air. And I think that's the moment where the movie sort of plays with the idea of the fantastical, and everything isn't exactly grounded in real life. And so it's that moment that lends me to believe that the end is actually something much more fantastical. Obviously, she wouldn't have been able to just like walk in the door, because they make the point for how much he sort of barricaded himself in and locked the door, and then she just appears there. She's embracing him, and he's obviously covered in barbed wire at this point. That wouldn't make sense in sort of a realistic manner. And so I think that the ending is much more fantastical than literal. And I actually prefer this ending to the other 2 endings that Schrader was contemplating doing, which was either having Toller blow up the church or drink the drain cleaner, on camera. I actually prefer this over the other 2 options. And it's sort of the option that I like, an ambiguous ending. And so for me, this is my kind of ending, but I could definitely see how it's not everyone's cup of tea if you have a problem with, the ambiguity of it.
Yeah, I think I wanted the fantastical ending to be a little bit more fantastical. Like, it's too close to reality. And if we're saying, because if that's a literal ending, it doesn't make sense. And I hate it. It's terrible. If it's a fantastical ending, cool. Can we make it more wild? That's kind of like, it's such a weird little like nitpick that I have with it, but that's like the one piece where I'm like, man, could we have just gone a little over the top? Like, we already had these 2 flying through space. Like, couldn't we do something that's equally ridiculous to just make sure that we all know? But I guess the ambiguity is it's a feature, not a bug. And so I think that's my one little nit is I want it to be a little bit more insane. I want it to be a little more wild, but
yeah, if I had to pick a nit too, I would say the abruptness of the end is so jarring. The way it cuts to black at just sort of like a very hard moment, and it's obviously an intentional decision by Schrader, and there's meaning behind it, but it just kind of leaves me in this state of, wait a minute, I haven't got a resolution. I need to, and like I said, I think that's his intention, is he wants you to really be pondering what you've just witnessed. But it's very jarring every time I go back to it. It just cuts like out of nothing.
And what's also fascinating is that when the ending credits start to roll, there's this like sound effect of this like whooshing sound in the background too, which I thought was so interesting and intentional to feel this like almost the wind is blowing, but in this empty space, and that emptiness and that feeling of emptiness is also just jarring. We're just kind of left with like a, oh my, but there's the other thing that I felt about the ending is very much, I read it like more literally at first, and then you think about it more and you're like, well, the door was clearly locked and there's a very clear shot of them, with the door locked. So, but it's oddly mixed in its emotion as well. It's not this purely tragic ending for this character, even though in the literal realm it is. But emotionally, what we see on screen is this moment of what seems to be human connection. And of all of the characters and people that he's interacted with, this was the only person that he actually had a real connection with. And I think that's really like a fascinating dimension of that ending too, is regardless of what happened to our character in the physical realm, the desires of his heart were to just connect with people, and and it kind of further heightens that feeling of isolation and disconnection and loneliness that obviously we see him really battle through over the course of the movie. I don't know if I would even say he was battling through; he was more just like succumbing to it. But that shot almost is like the culmination of every desire that he's had that was suppressed and denied, that he could finally, almost in a cathartic, dreamlike state, finally be able to satisfy. And so there's this weird, like, mixed feeling that I had of like, okay, like this is not a happy story, but also there's something human about his desires that we all have too, to just be with people. And every other person that he encounters in his day-to-day life, Jeffers, the other woman, the people at the kitchen, we don't see that like real sharing of hearts and souls together the way that we got to see with him and Mary. Also notable that her name's Mary, so there's a whole thought train around that front too. But I thought that mixed feeling at the ending was really interesting.
Yeah, and it's a shame that this movie, I feel like it's sort of kind of boxed in by, there are people who probably just see the cover of it, or just like maybe read a quick thing and they think, oh, this is a religious movie, and maybe if they have an aversion to religion or religious films or whatever the case may be, I feel like they might be like, I don't want to watch that because I think I know what that's going to be. When in actuality, I find this to be a really interesting film where obviously religion is at the forefront of it to a degree, but there's a lot of universal themes throughout this movie dealing with guilt, isolation, loneliness, doubt, hope. Ultimately, the idea, we might talk about this, the idea of what we've done to our planet as a collective species and how we're all grappling with that. There's so many universal things about this movie that I wish more people would give this movie a chance. It doesn't feel like a movie that enough people talk about or see, because I think they're just like immediately drawn away from it for whatever reason. When there's actually a lot of movies by like Martin Scorsese that are much more steeped in actual religion, a movie like Silence, where that movie's really about religion in its entirety, whereas this movie has religion as sort of a piece to it, but there's a lot more universal truth to this movie than I wish more people would watch this movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like religion is almost like the vehicle to get us to explore all of these other things. So it's not about the religion itself. It's not about that, but it's about these various destinations that we arrive at and these various themes. And I so appreciate that they all coexist in this movie, which is very hard to do. There's so many themes. Like, we could just spend hours and hours and hours talking about this movie because it's so densely packed, but it doesn't feel overwhelming. It doesn't feel disjointed. It all connects together. And so I mean, props to Paul Schrader for pulling this off somehow. It's just so well written. And what I appreciate is that you can tell that these are themes and ideas that he's been dealing with and thinking about for years. You know, you can trace some of these throughout some of his movies. And it's just cool to see when somebody has been a filmmaker for so many years, or they've been a writer for so many years, you can see the seeds of these things throughout. And I feel like First Reformed is kind of a culmination of a lot of those ideas that he's been grappling with over his career.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that's one of the things that when I was doing my comparison, contrasting throughout this movie with Taxi Driver, that I felt was decidedly different between those two protagonists, that like their trajectories have a lot in common. But Travis, you see attempt again and again to build connection and try to exist and try to survive in society in the ways that he can. And we see that Toller like has really, he's barely trying. He's almost like resigned and condemned himself to that loneliness, out of the guilt that we learn from everything that happened with his son. And so there's this like a surrender that he has to this, just his fate. And obviously it gets more extreme and ignited in a new way by his interactions with Michael. But I thought that to your point earlier, Andrew, around this being set in this context, felt so intentional in that we see how much Toller tries to like keep up appearances and play this role. And now that there's such a contrast between this persona that we see him like at the soup kitchen and when he's out with Jeffers, and he seems to be okay and jovial in the ways that he can be, and pleasant and whatnot. And then that contrast with his journals, that disconnect is huge. That chasm is huge. And especially in religious communities, that can be a difficult, isolating aspect, is like the feeling and pressures to play the role and do the things that you're supposed to do while suffering silently. And I feel like we got to see that a lot more with Toller in comparison to Travis. We get to see he's just like a loose cannon from the beginning, but making these like very genuine attempts to like try and figure it out. And I feel like Toller, especially as a priest in this small community, has resigned himself to this life. And so when someone like Michael comes along, you can see how it's breeding ground for more extreme ideas. So that religious framing feels so intentionally designed, because theoretically we take this character and put him in other contexts. It could work, but why did Schrader choose this context, this framing?
Yeah, that's just, it's so interesting to think about, especially because there's such an emphasis on the environment too. And so like when you think of like religion and religious institutions, I don't naturally think of, you know, saving the planet and the climate crisis and all of that. Like usually there's a pretty big separation between those two. And so I think that also just adds an interesting level to this, and that Schrader is connecting these two things and these two themes together that we might not naturally think are connected, but there might be maybe more there than meets the eye, and that he uses this religion like framing to explore, you know, I mean, even things like despair, you know, you wouldn't naturally associate that with religion, but it's just such a great avenue to explore these greater themes that he has some feelings about. And so we're going to talk about them.
Yeah, and Jen, you had mentioned earlier there's that scene with Michael, which I think is really, that's the first pivotal moment in the movie for me where it feels like the movie's starting to unlock itself. And I had never thought about the idea of martyrdom in religion compared directly to martyrdom of environmentalists. I think that was a really interesting comparison that Schrader made in the screenplay of the movie, that Michael and Toller are having that sort of tug of war philosophically about. I really found that idea of martyrdom to be something that stuck with me, and I've thought about multiple times. That again, I had never thought of the idea of martyrdom in that real sense compared to religious martyrdom, which is kind of all I'd ever really associated that term with. And so, yeah, just a really fascinating. This does feel like the culmination, like you said, Sarah. This is the culmination of all of Schrader's work up until this point. I think this is probably his best, tightest script, because it's one heck of a feat to make something so dense and so heavy not feel that way. Like, this movie feels palatable in a strange way, even though it's a lot to absorb.
Okay, that's one thing that I did not expect, is that there's these moments that are really funny in this movie. And I'm like, I don't know if I'm supposed to be laughing. I don't know if I'm laughing because I'm uncomfortable and that's my defense mechanism, but I'm cracking up at some of these moments. And it's the moment where Michael's funeral choir is singing Who's Gonna Save the Earth and the possible thing. That was like, okay, it's not me. The movie is giving me moments of levity because it knows that I need it, and we all need it in order to survive this experience. But yeah, it's sharp and funny in ways that, obviously that scene is very funny, but there's these other moments that, like, if you step back, you're like, this is kind of silly and ridiculous, like, but also like really meaningful too. And that's really fun and really unexpected in a movie like this. When this movie started, I did not expect to laugh ever in the next 2 hours, but I did. And even some of the like banter between what's his name, between Toller and Jeffers, where they're like quoting scripture at each other, I'm just like kind of cracking up. Like, they're just like wielding these like little tidbits back and forth at each other that are so out of context, but like, this is their way to argue. And like, they're not even saying real sentences, they're just like saying scripture at each other. I thought that was really funny too.
It's genius casting to get Cedric the Entertainer for that role. I mean, because he like you said, he adds moments of levity just by his general nature and, being a comedian first and foremost, but he does feel very much like that type of reverend pastor for those large, sort of almost corporate churches at this point. And not a knock on them to any degree, but he's larger than life. He's big, he's animated. Just phenomenal casting. I would have never thought to put him in that role, but when you see it, you're like, oh, of course, he's wonderful in that role.
And I love that we don't get to see him do his full thing with the shine and the powder until later. And then when that comes and we get to see, like, it's like a small 10-second clip of him doing his thing, we're like, yes, and yes. But like, we knew that he had that in him, but then I love when we get a little snippet of like them in the media room with him doing his thing, and you're like, oh my gosh, we all have seen and know that type of energy that's brought to the screen.
And I can only say this now because this show has only recently come out, but now when I watch First Reformed, it's hard for me not to also think about The Righteous Gemstones, which is on HBO, which is sort of a mockery or a spoof of that type of large church organization. And so, yeah, it's hard for me to see Cedric the Entertainer now and not think of The Righteous Gemstones and, Danny McBride and them sort of playing up that character, because those two things kind of work in an interesting way together. So I like everything about Cedric and his character and the way they sort of juxtapose the large church with this much smaller church. And, there can be the argument of which church is, more true to religion. And, there's religious conflict amongst Christians and people that are in the communities, like, my church is better, or my church is better. And we've all been, I think, in those scenarios. I grew up very strict Roman Catholic for most of my life, and so I know how it's like. There's almost a competition who's holier in these churches. So I thought that was a really interesting dynamic there too.
Well, and I love that through Jeffers and his church, you also see like the financial side and the maybe not on the up and up finances stuff with that large corporation. So I love it's small, the movie is not focused on that, but I love that Schrader took the time to also include that in there, because it's a very real thing in our world today. And so I love that, even though it's not the main focus of the film, he was like, I'm just going to include this in here because it's so true to life. And so why not use this opportunity to shine a light on this too? And of course the big corporation is also doing shady environmental stuff and, messing or influencing government regulation and all of that. So again, it's so dense, but it doesn't feel out of place. And I think it's because it feels so true to life. And so then seeing it on the screen, it's like, oh yeah, that does happen. Okay, let's think about that for a minute.
It's so topical, and it doesn't feel like it's going to go out of style anytime soon. It feels like it's going to remain relevant for the immediate future.
Yeah, that's for sure. It's so interesting how many some of these themes, only 4 years ago, and I'm like, if anything, we've probably just continued, and these themes are even more relevant than now today than they even were in 2017. But one of the technical pieces, Cassandra, I know that you were really appreciating some of that, especially in these later watches of recent, is just like that feel. Obviously they mention the financial flow that is happening, but we get to feel it too. Like every time Toller walks into the Abundant Life Church, you feel the wealth, and there's so many establishing shots that are from the second, third balcony that's overlooking this giant space, this piece of real estate that has been built, this giant logo and the sign. And so those establishing shots are really effective at feeling like, one, this is a grand place that he's walking into, but two, it communicates the emotional aspects of Toller is out of his element, because we've seen him in isolation in a small room by himself, bare bones, no decor, nothing, and then going into the space, he is out of his element as well, as are we. And the way that the visuals further the themes and at the cognitive level, I thought that was some really great stuff that you don't really think about when it's happening. You just feel it. But then when you go back to really tease apart the movie a little bit more, you're like, every single time we get some of those establishing shots.
Yeah, because on the flip side, with the big church that Jeffers has, Toller, you're constantly dealing with, he's dealing with plumbing issues in the bathroom. The organ just can't get right until it gets helped out by the Abundant Life. When he's given the tour, they don't have the right size t-shirts. He's trying to give them a hat just to nothing that Toller's doing at his job. He's not doing a very good job at his job. And it's just it's abundantly clear that he was not meant for this life. And he's sort of forced himself to go this route because he thinks it's the only route that's sort of there to help him deal with his own guilt that he's just sort of bottled up inside of him. And yeah, so it's very interesting to see the dynamic between the two churches, because like you said, the framing, everything's very small, tight, compact in First Reformed, and then when you go to Abundant Life, like you said, there's these real high wide angle shots, and you're just like, wow, this is a cathedral of riches here.
I would also crack up every time they would show the Abundant Life giant logo, because I'm just like, no one is having an abundant life in this movie. Everyone is sad and lost and figuring out what their purpose is in life. And there's this giant claim that apparently we are all whole, healthy human beings here. And none of the characters that we've met are that. So I thought that was really funny too. What were some of the other technical components that this time around, or perhaps in the last couple times around, really were notable and exciting to have observed and seen?
Well, I touched upon it earlier, but I think, like I said, the score or the lack thereof early on, and really that first shot sets so much up for the whole film, the way it's that slow zoom in on First Reformed. Again, you're getting the aspect ratio right out of the way, so it's kind of tight in on it. The skies above it are gloomy, so it's sort of setting a mood and an atmosphere without telling you anything. And then, like I said, there's no score. You just hear the wind. By the end of the movie, it's again sort of back to silent, but it's really in the middle when Toller's deep in his most torment and his toil. That's when the score starts coming in, and it's like I said, it's dissonant, it's disturbing, it like makes my skin crawl a little bit. Like it's you can never quite place when it's going to come in and what notes next, and it's just slightly throwing me off the whole film. And it's a really well done, understated score to set the mood for what's going on underneath inside of Toller. And that just, every time I go back to it, I'm sort of taken by, because we get so wrapped up in scores being these big, giant orchestral things and bombastic and loud, and this one's just much more focused. It's there when it needs to be, and it's not there when it doesn't need to be, and I appreciate that.
It's so funny. You hit on the two things that I was going to say. It's so good. What really impressed me this time about the score and the use of silence is that it's so quiet for so long, and then Toller goes to Abundant Life, and it's during choir rehearsal, and hearing music for the first time after it being so silent for so long, it's jarring. And like, they sound so good, the harmonies are great, I loved it, but at the same time I'm like, oh whoa, I'm almost overstimulated because I haven't heard music in so long. And I think that that's so effective almost in helping us better understand Toller too, because he lives such an isolated existence, and he really doesn't have any pleasures, like when I'm just like around the house, I'm listening to music, like I'm enjoying these things, but he doesn't do that. And so I loved that moment because it felt so, I was better able to empathize with Toller and understand how he lives his life, because he is also overwhelmed in that scene for a lot of different reasons. And so that just helped me get a peek into his brain.
That is the first time we hear music, but then also somehow, why is it so eerie? Because these children, the music's beautiful. Like the output is beautiful. If I close my eyes, it's beautiful, but their faces are so stoic as they're singing. Like it's not this like joyous outburst of emotion, and it almost feels like they were being taught to do this and to sing in this way, and it's very precise. And especially cutting back and forth between them singing and then I forget the woman's name, but she's kind of the choir director that is, I wouldn't say friend, an acquaintance of Toller, a past fling perhaps. She is so also serious about it that like it's a dissonance visually, but then audibly that I found really kind of terrifying, in this incredibly empty but very large, grand sanctuary as well. It's all just the right combination of things that made that moment also feel a little unsettling, even though the music was beautiful, and nailing that feeling of the viewer feeling unsettled and just having something off is really fun to see how they can design for that.
Yeah, and I think the spot where the score probably stands out for me the most is during that sequence when Mary's laying on top of Toller, and then they sort of go into space, as you mentioned, and it starts out very euphoric and wondrous and grand, and you see sort of the beauty of life and nature, and then it's when it shifts to all of the things humanity has done to Earth, that's Toller sort of seeing sort of the end of the planet. That's when the score gets really, really dark, and it contrasts really interestingly. And you see the fire at the end, and it's everything that happens in that particular scene has always fascinated me. Like I said, the way they levitate has its own connotations, and then just the idea of sort of humanity being nature's worst enemy is a really fascinating thing, because humanity is this wondrous, beautiful just thing that exists in life, and we don't fully know where it came from, and then humans arrive and we have sort of ruined this wondrous nature. And so yeah, it's a really interesting moment that happens in that scene.
I kept thinking about the soaring ride at Disney, if anyone's been on that ride. It's like, this is a really weird, twisted version of the soaring ride at Disney.
That's funny.
But yeah, what I love, which I think Schrader does well, because voiceover sometimes can be really like hit or miss in movies. Most of the time it's kind of a miss. Most of the time it's like, why are you explaining this when you could have shown it and that's what a movie's supposed to be, and not giving us like literally the explanations of how this character's feeling. But what I love, what Schrader does in this movie, is that we see him have a conversation with Michael, and obviously he's contemplating it, but he's not actually actively contemplating a lot of it in his journals, you know? And like, he's not thinking about these ideas, so that by the time he arrives at that true like revelation of what Michael was talking about, we've seen moments where he's discovered the connection with the corporation. He's studied a little bit more, but we don't actually get the full process of him changing his mindset and perception about this topic until that moment. So that moment feels exciting because it's like he really does see what Michael is seeing, but we don't get the full like step-by-step process of getting there, which I really appreciate, because I think it would have cheapened that scene, but also cheapened just kind of the journey of the movie. We see him sitting with the weight of the world on his shoulders and expressing the feelings, but not necessarily about that domain area, which I think I'm glad about, because I think it just wouldn't have been as effective of a film, and that moment wouldn't have felt as cathartic and meaningful.
It is weird how sort of like 50-50 Schrader is, even himself, with narration. Like Taxi Driver is a great example of it, and this film is a great example, but I could also point to The Card Counter or Master Gardener, which are a couple more recent films that I thought were okay, but they basically followed the exact same steps of troubled soul. We're going to narrate things, and he's going to keep a journal, and it's like they're sort of following the same beats, and those movies don't work as well. So it is kind of weird that Schrader hasn't like fully perfected this thing that he can do really well at times. It's just a fascinating thing for a writer that can be so up and down with his own abilities.
One of the other things that I'll mention about the way that he employs voiceover that I think really worked well in this movie, and this is also probably like some like genius like vision around the editing, is the moments where we hear some meaningful philosophical musing about a topic, but the visuals are something like really mundane or jarring, and the pairing of those two things together I think is just so exciting and so thrilling, and there's so much to feast on. So the two that I jotted down was he's having his whole voiceover musings about discernment, and it's just shots of him at his hands at his toilet, like cleaning his toilet that he's just gonna like throw up in the next scene. And then the second one was when he's talking about putting on the full armor of God and like repeating those verses as he's putting on the vest. I was like, this is, oh my gosh, that pairing, it heightens the voiceover and the concepts in the voiceover, but also adds these like extra layers of meaning, and also visually adds to the drama of the moment where he's putting this on, and that just showcasing how warped his thought processes have gone, that this is kind of where his mind's going. So I thought Schrader's work really shines when that voiceover is actually paired with these like really interesting visuals that heightened or complicate or open up the concepts that are being voiced over.
I also really love that this movie also kind of like keeps secrets from us as the audience. You know, there are certain times when Toller will talk about like, oh, I ripped those pages out of my journal, or, you know, there's certain parts of his inner dialogue that we don't get to hear. And I find that really fascinating, because so much of this is almost like his like stream of consciousness as he's journaling, and he's just writing all of this down. But even in that, he is still holding back to a degree. And I think that helps makes things interesting, especially given where he ends up. We get enough of a trail to understand kind of how he got there, but we don't have to know every single little detail of how he arrived at that. And I think that mystery around him actually helps make him more interesting as we go along.
That's so true. It's almost like the voiceover theoretically makes us feel like we are in his inner world, but jokes on us because we're actually not, which is really fun because usually the voiceover is like our true view into what this person's feeling and thinking, but he's an enigma to himself, really. Like, he doesn't even understand his own feelings. And we can kind of see that too in the way that the language is constructed in a section of voiceover, and that he will kind of go down a thought train and then kind of like walk it back and be like, well, but maybe no, but no. I think there's one of them where he was like, he's saying something like where he's like condemning someone else for being very prideful, and then he's like, who am I to talk about pride? And you're like, yeah, that self-reflectiveness, the self-awareness, really great, also really toxic, you know what I mean? And so his wishy-washiness about how he feels about things is we get a little glimpse into. But honestly, that's kind of how a lot of us think too. You know what I mean? We like go down a thought train and we're like, I don't know if I believe that. Let me walk this back and reassess it and turn it over in our minds more, and we get to see a little bit of that in his thinking.
This is also a movie I would love to own a physical screenplay of. There are certain ones that I'm thinking I would love to like see how that looked on paper, and this is definitely one of those, because as I was watching it the third time, that's when I really was trying to go through and like pull quotes and things like that. The amount of profound dialogue that happens in this movie is like, every time I go back to it, I find a new line where I'm like, wow, that like hits in a different way. Like, one, this third time was Toller at one point says, every act of preservation is an act of creation. Everything preserved renews creation. It's how we participate in creation. And that's just a line where I was like, that is such a fascinating way to look at creation and life and our part in it. And there's so many moments like this throughout the movie where there's a line that just, like I said, it rings universally true to everyone and all of our experiences in life. And so, this is a movie one day I hope to own the screenplay too, because I think it would be a really fun, enjoyable read to pull all of these extra lines that I've probably still not caught at this point.
So you're going to have these like on your doormat, on a mug, hanging over your bookshelf, just donning your home decor.
Prominently displayed up on the wall behind me, yeah.
No, that's so true. Honestly, there's so many times where he's just, like ruminating, and he's kind of right in a lot of ways, which is kind of frustrating because like he's such a frustrating character, but also there's a lot of truth and wisdom and revelation that he does seem to have. The one that I jotted down was him telling Michael, wisdom is being able to hold two truths at the same time. I was like, yeah, that is really true. I mean, his version of it is holding hope and despair, and perhaps we've made a lot more room for one of these than the other, but there is truth to a lot of what he's saying, which makes him an even more fascinating character because he's not unreliable. He's not off his kilter. There's something that's grounded in really profound revelation. It's been twisted and goes down a different path, but there's a lot of raw material there that he's got that's really great.
You could pull multiple things out of that conversation with Michael. That's probably a scene I've probably gone back to the most. And Toller even says towards the end of that conversation that he's sort of enjoying the debate. I think he mentions sort of wrestling like with the lion in the lion's den, and just like the idea that he's getting satisfaction out of having these deep philosophical debates. And I feel like a lot of us do that in our day-to-day. I know I certainly do, where sometimes things can get a little contentious, but sometimes like that's a good way to come out of it with a better understanding of someone else's situation. And I love all of the dynamic in that particular conversation and scene.
I have a friend that calls it big talk. Yeah. She's like, I don't know how to do small talk, but I'm really great at big talk. She's like, I don't want to talk about like our weekend. I'm like, let's talk about like the foundations of like the whatever, blah, 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 society, blah. So it's funny. One of the other scenes that is just kind of thrown in there and seemingly nothing at first, but like I found myself thinking a lot about, because perhaps we're in an election year where there's a lot of feelings and opinions and whatnot, but it's when Toller's at the youth group and there's he's starting to share basically a counter thought to the prosperity gospel, and then the young boy quickly interrupts him and kind of takes what he says and misinterprets it, and then takes the misinterpretation in a really extreme way. Then it somewhere lands along the lines of like, well, then why stand for anything? And I just thought that was such a fascinating picture of when there's a lot of big extreme ideas and we're not really listening to each other. The costs are so high, and I'm like, why do I feel like this conversation I've seen happen a million times before, but this was 2017, which was also a contentious year, but that like disconnect in human beings communicating each other I thought was so notable. And honestly, Toller's conclusion out of that was also kind of wrong. He's like, well, why are the youth so extreme now? It's like, well, this was one moment with one youth who had very like big ideas, but he's also doing the same thing that young boy was doing as well, which I thought was kind of fascinating. So that scene stood out to me a lot. Felt very resonant, but also accurately captured. Traders accurately captured a very real dynamic in human beings trying to tackle big ideas together, which is important and we need to, but kind of the things that can go awry when we try to.
Yeah, I wrote that. I'm glad you pointed that out. I wrote that same sort of scene in that line of dialogue where Toller says, everything's so extreme. There's no middle ground. Us versus them. We're right. They're wrong. Let's go to war. I'm like, oh my God, that is like...
Yeah, let's not put this on the doormat. I'll just save that for...
Yeah, that is a bold statement that like you said, it's an election year and people get crazy on both ends, and we're in that sort of state right now where everything's just, it's us versus them, and it doesn't need to always be that way. And so I thought that was another profound line of dialogue in the movie.
Well, and it's so interesting too, because we've spent so much time with Toller while he's by himself and just thinking about these lofty ideas, and there are these moments when he has such wisdom, and then he'll just like swing to this other perspective, and it's like, oh my gosh, no, like let's reel that back in, like you took a left turn somewhere, like let's try again. And again, I feel like that's really relatable, because it's very easy to just like, oh, I'm just thinking thoughts, and then we end up somewhere that we never intended upon ending up. And so we just see that over and over with him, and in different contexts. And as infuriating as he is, because he is a very frustrating protagonist, there are these really human parts to him. And so it's like, oh yeah, I do that too. Okay, cool. Like I can't be too hard on the guy, because I am guilty of those things from time to time as well.
Yeah, he's kind of a character where it's like looking at a mirror at ourselves sometimes, at sort of the ugly side of all of us, where it's like, that rings a little too true sometimes to our worst instincts.
Yeah, very much so. I'm curious your thoughts about something that I read that Schrader mentioned in an interview, that this film was meant to be seen as a trilogy with The Card Counter and Master Gardener, which I had not thought about. And it's an interesting framing, even for him to like position it as a trilogy to the public is fascinating. I've only seen, obviously, this one now in Card Counter. I haven't seen Master Gardener. It sounds like, Andrew, you've seen all three. Sarah, I don't know, have you seen Master Gardener yet?
No, not yet. That's been on my list.
Okay.
It's on my to watch list. I just haven't gotten to it.
Okay. I'm curious what especially you, Andrew, since you've seen all three of them. Thoughts on that framing of these three kind of being in a group lumped together, and potentially an overarching arc or thematic theming of these three together?
It certainly makes sense. It's funny. I did not know that he had considered them a trilogy when I mentioned earlier, like the idea, like the narration is hit or miss. Card Counters,
It was okay.
I thought Card Counter was okay. Master Gardener, I would consider a notch above, but it's nowhere near First Reformed. I'm a big Joel Edgerton fan, who plays the main character in Master Gardener, and he's very good. But I think that his character in Master Gardener and Oscar Isaac's in Card Counter are much more similar. And I don't know if I could pull the three of them together. That's an intro. I'll have to go back and watch the three of them like in succession and torture myself through that. Or that would be a really intense trilogy to watch in a day.
So you're going to whip out your journal and you're like, okay, let's go. Here I am in a room, a dark room.
I do keep a I keep a movie journal. I'm going to ask you too if you keep journals, but I do keep a movie journal. So like when I'm watching stuff, I'm like jotting down my notes, and that would be a really intense three page section if I were to knock those 3 movies out in a day.
But the key is very dark room. Okay, one tiny little lamp where you can barely see your journal requirement.
Yeah.
At night.
All I need is a bowl and some bread and some liquor, and I'll be good.
The liquor's a requirement. Yeah. There needs to be nothing on your walls. You've got to look like an absolute psycho. It's a requirement as well.
So do either of you keep journals in day-to-day life for any
That's a good question.
reason?
I keep a journal. I'm not like a daily journaler, but when I have big thoughts that beg to be written down, I'll write them down. And my entries are not usually very long. They're like maybe half a page, sometimes 2 pages. And then they're very like chaotic too. Like we're not like a stream of consciousness type of journaler. We're more like a here's a thought and also here's another thought, and like they don't connect, but they're all on the page somehow. So that is my chaotic journaling. Sarah, what about you?
Yeah, I am not a journaler. I have tried throughout my life to become a journaler because I have so many friends that journal, and they're like, oh my gosh, it's so great. Da 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 da, like just singing the praises of journaling. And I've tried and I just don't do it. It's only like if I have if there's an idea that I'm thinking about, then like I'll write it down or I'll type it out and really like dig into it. But yeah, I am not a daily journaler.
Well, maybe you should start journaling every day for a year.
Gosh,
see where that takes you.
Sounds horrible. Like I have tried so many times throughout my life to be a journaler, and I do it for like a week and then I'm like, I'm done.
Fine.
I for sure when I was like wondering if either of you journaled, I thought for sure Sarah would say yes, just based on like some of your other Instagram pages where you do some sort of like really nice like wisdom stuff, and I thought for sure you were a journaler based on some of the other things I've seen on your Instagram pages where I'm like, you've got the right attitude to be a journaler.
And I'm not, so it's just right, like it feels right that I would be a journaler, and I'm just
it does.
I don't know.
It does.
Maybe someday.
You know what? Apparently you don't need the like staging ground. It's just like pure wisdom genius comes out and onto the page and onto the Instagram. It's great. But Andrew, it sounds like you keep a movie journal.
I do. It was something I started this year. I just I watch so many movies and consume so much that like it's sometimes hard to collect my thoughts, and then like a month later I'll try to assemble them for whatever. And this year I'm like, you know what? I'm going to make a concerted effort when I watch a movie. I'm going to, take my notes in real time. And I wouldn't say I'm great at it yet, but it's like, I don't know, it's like 60-40 where when a movie comes on, I'll at least like note a couple of like the cast members and make a few technical notes or make a few acting notes, and then at the end I'll like sort of give it a score so I can letterbox log it at a later date. And so I'm working on it, but it's not in my nature to journal, but I'm trying.
Nice, that's awesome. And I've noticed from socials that you're like a tactile journaler, like you've got pen and paper for it. Yeah.
Oh yes, and maybe it's because in my day-to-day job I sell pens and paper, and so it's just research. Good for the system to So, but yeah, I have like a standard like legal pad, and I will write down all my notes in physical form, and then I have a really nice fancy journal that I write. So yeah, it's very much pen to paper. I'm not so good at I'm not good at throwing it in like a Word document. I feel like I need to physically put it on paper for me to journal properly.
That's awesome.
Even though I have really bad handwriting.
I mean, you don't write in all caps, apparently, like a psychopath.
No, but I don't do cursive very well either. I'm so out of practice on cursive.
Somewhere in between. Yeah, something about Toller doesn't peg me as a digital journaler. He's not clickety clacking away like Carrie Bradshaw style, like Sex and the City. It's very much all caps on lined paper only.
I would love to know more about Toller's life with
Oh,
wife
yes.
and child. I'm so fascinated about
Yeah.
his former life. We get such a small, teeny tiny little crack in the window to see maybe what was kind of going on there. But I would just love to know, was he a good family man? Like, did that death of his son so fundamentally shift his
Yeah.
perspective on things that led him down this path, or was he always kind of this way? Yeah, he's a character I would love to deep dive into more. And I wonder if Schrader and Ethan Hawke talked about it, like the backstory. I don't know, but I'd be fascinated to learn more about Toller's existence.
Yeah, agreed. I think especially seeing how much of a soft spot he has for Mary is fascinating. Like the minute she walks into the church, there's no question in his mind. Like he takes the vest off quickly. But then also there's that moment with the woman who's like the choir director, which I thought was really notable. It's one of the first times we see him lose control. He's so suppressed and so disciplined in not showing and expressing his emotion, but that's a moment where he kind of loses it. And I just wondered like what happened between them, like because he says like you are a reminder of the worst parts of me and the mistakes that I made, blah blah blah. So I don't know if like did he cheat after his son's death and that's why there was like so much more emotion there, or was it because like as his role as a priest he like has had to keep the secret. But the intensity of the emotion seems to suggest that it was something that really like touched on something dear to him that would beg for an emotional reaction like that. And so yeah, that scene in particular also I think is fascinating to unpack because it's one of the few times we see him truly express a genuine raw emotion outwardly in public with someone else.
And we get that one little scene where he's giving a tour of the church to the small children and showing them into like the basement. And it's that little moment where I'm like, okay, he seems really good with kids. And I'm like, okay, I believe
Yeah.
that he was a good father. Whether or not he was a good husband, that maybe is a whole other question with his probably alcoholism, even dating back to that point in time. But I feel like he was probably a good father because he seemed good with the kids. And I
Yeah.
liked that scene because it humanized him in a way where I'm like, okay, I can buy into this guy as a protagonist just enough. He's not a perfect protagonist, but there's humanity in him. And there's still some hope. The light hasn't fully dimmed out yet.
And he seems so much more comfortable with those kids too, which I also think is so fascinating. So it's like, okay, have you been almost like wearing a mask with all of the adults and you're able to take that off with the kids and this is closer to how you are as a person? Or are you, when interacting with these kids, able to put on that mask even better to feel more comfortable relating to them? So it's just that scene is so interesting because we haven't seen Toller like that any other time in the movie, and so that just raises more questions than anything else.
Yeah, that softness and that warmth we definitely didn't see for most of this movie. A rare little moment.
And it comes right after his sort of hallucinogenic moment where he sees both the positive and the negative of life. And like it's back to your point, Jen, about the editing. I thought that was a really fantastic stark cut from that scene to the scene with the kids. And I'm like, okay, again, there's intentionality here from Schrader. It's just another moment for us to unpack all of these many, many, many questions that we're an hour plus into this, and like we barely scratched the surface of the levels to this movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so true. And I think another dimension in this movie that you just mentioned, because you called him a protagonist, which I was like, yeah, I think he is a protagonist. Like because sometimes this type of character is not like I'm not rooting for you. You know what I mean? Like they're portrayed to be kind of more twisted from the beginning. But I think that like what also makes Toller a protagonist that we want to root for is that like his instincts of what he cares about seem to be right. They're just extreme and they are tinged with all of the other like darkest parts of guilt and despair that are making it take a left turn. But you know, it was in that scene where he's talking to Jeffers, where he's talking about like this desire to protect and care for and steward creation and beauty and nature. It's so good. It's just something that's such a pure intention that like really took a left turn. But I think that's also what makes him our protagonist and makes us root for him, is like his instincts are really right until they took a left turn. And that feels like someone we want to root for. They've just lost their way, or they've taken it a little too far, but the direction they were running in is not wrong, you know? And I think that is a fascinating difference between some of our other, you know, tortured male protagonists, for lack of a better word, in other movies that are like from the beginning, just we can tell there's a lot of darkness in them that is twisted and evil. But this one's like he is inherently good, and we get insinuations of his previous life being good. It's just taken a little bit of a turn, and I think that's a fascinating part of how this character's been written too.
Yeah, to tie it back to Taxi Driver, I would be very hard to call Travis Bickle a protagonist. He, to me, does not fit the bill, whereas I think Toller's much more in line with somebody that, like I said, I could find myself rooting for. I believe that he has hope inside him. There's enough moments, we see enough glimpses in there. And so again, like to your point, Jen, sure, there are parallels between Taxi Driver and First Reform, but they also veer in very different directions at points, one of which is I think Travis is a dark character to begin with, and even if he's trying to find his way out of it, whether that's intentional or not, I think that he is that character, and I think that Toller is very on the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, agreed. And perhaps the other dimension is how the lack of joy that Toller seems to have in carrying out his act. You know, I think you mentioned this earlier, but the concept of martyrdom feels fitting for what he feels like he's doing. Whereas Travis, there's kind of this like gleeful, like sadistic part of him that's like kind of having a little too much fun, you know what I mean? And so that's also a difference. Like he feels like this truly is his responsibility, and he's just believing something that isn't true, but he feels the weight of it. And I think that's maybe another distinction between the two of them, is like Toller's not having a good time carrying out some of this stuff, you know? He's very much a sad human trying to find his way.
Yeah, Jeffers makes the point at one moment in the scene where he tells him, he's like, you're living in this all the time. You don't have to be in this, you know? And it's like Toller has forced himself into this own prison that he's in. And it's obviously not a healthy situation. And I think Schrader's very obviously telling us, don't go down this path of isolation, guilt, self-loathing, all of these things that he's dealing with, because it can only lead to a bad outcome. You can have a sense of despair, but you also have to have plenty of hope to outweigh it, to keep going.
I love that. Now that is also a snippet that I would love to see on Torment. You need plenty of hope to outweigh the despair that we might experience. Okay. I think, any other last big thoughts before we wrap? Little shout outs.
I do have a silly thing
okay,
for this very serious movie. So I have this knack for spotting pinky rings in films. And I have a hypothesis that if you see particularly, we've narrowed it down in scope a little bit. If you see a white, straight, male person wearing a pinky ring in a movie, they're often a bad guy. There is a pinky ring in this film worn by Toller. So that does not fit my hypothesis, but I do think that it is a notable example.
They could have, half 0.25 of a data point. He does arguably, well,
it's mixed at best. So
it's mixed.
He's not like a flat out villain, though. I feel like a lot of them are villains, but he's,
after we've just called him a protagonist for the past 20 minutes.
I feel like most of the time when I see a pinky ring, it's pretty isolated to Italians in gangster films. I'm going to have to be on the lookout more for pinky. I've never once worn a pinky ring. I'm proud to say that. I never will wear a pinky ring. I don't believe at any point in my life.
It doesn't
really
apply
fit my
to
style,
like
I don't
real
think.
life people. Like it's just in movies. I mean, I guess it could, but I'm
could.
not trying to like. I'm not trying
I'll have to be on the
be
lookout.
mean to any pinky ring wearers out there. You know, it's just in the movies.
We found that a lot of gangsters, mafia, mob characters, they all are decked out. Yeah, they've got a flair for like the fashion, the jewelry, the power, wealth to spend. You know, so the Japanese gangsters in movies often also have a whole stack that they're rocking.
When I close my eyes, I just see Joe Pesci.
Yep.
Perfect.
It's like he's the prototypical guy with a pinky ring
on both hands too. Because why have one? You know, he's got a lot he needs to prove. All right. Well, this was our review and discussion of First Reformed. I love that we ended on such a light-hearted, fun note. That was wonderful. Beautiful. Well done, everybody. You can find it available to stream on a host of multiple streaming platforms. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Movies and Us. And a big thank you to you, Andrew, 1, for recommending this movie for us to get to watch together, but then 2, for joining us to share all of your thoughts and opinions about this very serious movie after Princess Bride. We hope you come back again. We promise we won't do something quite so heavy, but you know what? It was really meaningful and really fun to unpack this movie together, this work of art.
I am so glad I was able to be the one to help you see this the first time, Jen. That's a nice distinction I'll always get to carry with me. And Sarah, I'm glad that we were able to to talk about this together, because I feel like you've been clamoring to talk about this with someone else, and I certainly have. I don't have too many friends in my life who have seen First Reformed, so yeah, very, very, very glad to be a part of this. Thank you both again. If you ever want me on the show, I'm happy to do it. And for anyone that wants to find me, you can find me on all the socials handles at Rev Almanac. And again, we dive into past Oscar ceremonies. We figure out what they got right, what they got wrong. We nominate our own things, and then we put them up in head-to-head battles online against the actual winners. And whatever the online community picks to be the winner of those categories goes into the Almanac. And I can't wait to have the two of you on in 2025. And we're going to be talking about the year 2003, which is The Lord of the Rings, Return of the King winning Best Picture. There's a lot of fantastic movies that year, and we will take a deep dive into that year for the people, and we'll see what comes out of it.
That'll be really fun. Always so fun. Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us. And yeah, we will include all of the ways to follow and find Andrew and more of his work, his conversations, his takes on the interwebs, where you can follow Revisionist Almanac as well. We'll include all of that in the show notes. So we highly recommend checking out him and his work. All right. Well, our name, Movies and Us, sums it up. We're all about movies and the powerful ways we can connect with each other and the world around us. This podcast is about all of us and our shared stories, so everyone is welcome here, and we're so glad you spent time with us today. You can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you tune to your favorite shows. Drop us a rating and review, letting us know your thoughts about First Reformed. You can connect with us on Instagram, Threads, and TikTok at moviesandUsPod, or email us at moviesandUsPod@gmail.com. We will be back next week to discuss a very different kind of movie. Just in time for spooky season, we'll be covering Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey 2. We're so excited, y'all. We're like disproportionately excited. This is going to be a good time. Really good time. We hope you have an amazing week, and we'll talk again very soon.